Before the Buddha passed away, he encouraged his disciples to visit the four places where the pivotal events in his life had taken place, where he was born, where he achieved enlightenment, where he taught the Dhamma for the first time, and where he passed away. And since that time, devout Buddhists have been going to those places, making pilgrimages to them. And this is a practice that continues right up to today. And I think it's a very wholesome practice. It gives people the opportunity to have a physical presence in some sense with the Buddha himself. You get some idea of what the world in which he lived looked like. And some people, myself included, sometimes are deeply moved to feel that they may be actually walking on or coming into direct contact with actual places where the Buddha lived. Today I'd like to talk about one of the most significant places of pilgrimage that the modern pilgrim can visit. One of the usual places that everybody stops at is Vaishali, just directly north of Patna, about 40 or 50 kilometers directly north of Patna. And today there are several things you can see there. There's one of the pillars of King Asoka. Right beside that is a large stupa. Around that stupa are numerous small stupas, and then there is a large reservoir, artificial reservoir. And there's a small museum, and that's about it. But some way from the museum, a little south of the museum, is a dome-shaped structure. And under that is a sort of a curious-looking thing. It doesn't really look very impressive, but in actual fact, it is probably one of the most significant physical things concerning the Buddha himself. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. So, when the Buddha passed away, they had a funeral ceremony for quite some time, actually. There was singing and dancing and reflection. And in that time, word of the Buddha's passing had spread. And so 8 claimants, representatives from from various kingdoms and chieftains and individuals came wanting to have the relics. So there was a dispute amongst them as to who should have what. In the end, it so happened that there was a Brahmin in Kusinara at that time, and he offered to arbitrate between these arguing factions. And so he divided up the relics, and each of the recipients announced that they would build a stupa over their share of the relics. One of those groups who got a share of the relics were the Licchavis, which were an ethnic group in the Vajjian Republic, of which was made up of 3 or 4 chieftains that had come together in a confederation for safety reasons. The Licchavis received 1 share of the relics, and like the others, they announced that they would build a stupa over their share. And indeed they did. Now, when we see stupas today, we see really quite distinct and often quite impressive structures. I'm thinking of the great Shwetagong Pagoda in Rangoon, probably one of the most magnificent Buddhist shrines ever built. It's such a wonderful place, but there are many others. They're very impressive structures. But it's important to remember that stupas existed before the time of the Buddha. So it was the tradition in Magadha and Kosala, in that part of the country, that when a great leader, perhaps a very popular king or a very saintly person died, it was normal to cremate their body and put their ashes, under a mound of earth. And indeed, that's what the first stupas were. They weren't these impressive structures that we see today. They were simply a mound of earth. Then, over the centuries, as the architecture of stupas became more elaborate, of course we started to see the type of stupas that we see today. But in the beginning, they were simple mounds of earth. Now, Vaishali, the ruins of Vaishali are really very sparse. There's not really much to see in Vaishali today other than the famous lion pillar and the large stupa beside it. But it must have been a very big city at one time. However, the Gandak River is just nearby, and over the centuries it has inundated the area around there, basically destroying most of the ruins of the city. Anyway, archaeologists have excavated parts of what they think was parts of the ancient city from time to time. But in the 1950s, an attempt was made to find various locations which were known to have existed, and one of these was the stupa built by the Licchavis. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The archaeologists did discover the foundations of the stupa that the Licchavis had built. The rest of the stupa must have been destroyed over the centuries. And this is an extremely interesting discovery. First of all, because it was conducted by modern scientific archaeological methods. And secondly, it seems to verify some of the things in Buddhist history and Buddhist tradition. Let me explain. So when the archaeologists discovered the foundations of this stupa, they were astonished to find that in actual fact there were 3 stupas there. The first stupa was the earthen stupa in which the Licchavis had erected and deposited the relics. Approximately 100 or maybe 150 years later, somebody had encased that earlier stupa with bricks to make it into a full dome, probably. And then 200 or 300 years later, somebody else had enlarged the stupa yet again using bricks. In other words, the Licchavi Stupa was a little bit like an onion. When you cut an onion, you see the earlier part inside, and then slightly bigger, and then slightly bigger. In this case, enlarged 2 times from the original earthen stupa. So this seemed to be proof, and it was estimated that this stupa had been built, first erected in about the 5th century BC, which corresponds pretty much exactly when the Buddha is known to have lived. The second thing is, they discovered something very interesting, that the enlargement, the first enlargement of the stupa probably dates from the Mauryan period. That is, the period in which King Asoka reigned. And they discovered that first, during the construction of this first enlargement, somebody had breached the earlier earthen stupa, probably in order to take the relics out and then replace them back in again. Now, the archaeologists found this to be very interesting because it seemed to verify the Buddhist tradition that King Asoka had opened all of the original 10 stupas, except for one, and taken a portion of the relics out so that he could build more stupas all around India and put small parts of the Buddha's relics in them. So this was quite a remarkable reformation, so this was quite a remarkable confirmation of an ancient Buddhist tradition. So this is why this stupa is so important. Unfortunately, the very nature of archaeological excavation is that when you excavate something, in a sense, you destroy it. And so if you look at the early photographs, archaeological photographs of the Licchavi Stupa, you can see very clearly the original stupa inside and then the two enlargements of later centuries. When you go there and look at it today, you really would scratch your head to wonder what it is, which is very important given that this structure is so important. Anyway, in the 1950s, after they excavated this stupa, the casket which they found inside and the relic which was inside the casket was simply taken to the nearest museum, that is in Patna, and it was put in the storerooms and it was just pretty much forgotten. And then only just recently, with the tremendous growth of Buddhist tourism and Buddhist pilgrimage in India, the Indian government decided to take that casket and the relic out of storage and give it a special place in the display in the Patna Museum. And if you go there today to Vaishali, you can see the original stupa, which was excavated in the 1950s, although I'd have to say it doesn't look very interesting today. And if you go to the Patna Museum, you can see the original casket with the original relic inside. Now, today there are more relics than I can count. They're all over the place. I've got serious doubts as to the authenticity of these. But one thing we can say for certain, or for a very high degree of certainty, is the relic that was found inside this stupa is about as close to the time of the Buddha as you could possibly get. And therefore we have to consider that it is very likely that it is an actual bodily relic of the Buddha himself.